What if the next time you were pulled over, it wasn't just about a broken taillight or a minor traffic violation? What if, in that moment, the people sworn to protect you decided you didn't belong, all because of the color of your skin? And what if they had no idea who you really were? Ava Carter wasn't your average driver. She had faced criminals, brought justice to those who thought they were untouchable, and wore the badge of an FBI agent with pride. But none of that mattered as she drove down a quiet suburban street in her casual clothes, just trying to get home. In the eyes of two police officers, she was nothing more than another face they could judge, and they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. How could they have known that the woman they were about to brutalize held more power than they could ever imagine? Ava Carter had always been proud of her ability to stay calm under pressure. After all, it came with the territory of being an FBI agent. She had faced down hardened criminals, infiltrated dangerous organizations, and made life-or-death decisions in the blink of an eye. But as she glanced in her rearview mirror at the flashing red and blue lights behind her, she felt a knot forming in her stomach that had nothing to do with fear. It was disappointment. She had done nothing wrong. In fact, she hadn't even been speeding, and her car, a sleek but modest sedan, was perfectly maintained. Yet here she was, being pulled over in the middle of a quiet suburban street in broad daylight. Ava sighed deeply, pulling over to the side of the road and turning off the engine. She didn't wear her badge off-duty, and her FBI credentials were tucked away in her purse. Today, she was just Ava, a black woman driving through a predominantly white neighborhood. The officer approached slowly, his hand resting on his belt in a way that wasn't necessary, but it spoke volumes. Ava rolled down her window, keeping her hands firmly on the steering wheel. She knew the drill, even though she shouldn't have to. "License and registration," the officer barked, without so much as a greeting. His voice was sharp, and his gaze never met hers, as if he'd already decided who she was without needing to look her in the eye. Ava handed over the documents without a word, her face calm. She had been here before. Maybe not in this exact situation, but she knew the feeling of being judged long before anyone took the time to ask the right questions. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, flipping through her papers without interest. "I'm not sure," Ava replied evenly, her voice betraying no emotion. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "There's a report of a vehicle matching your description involved in suspicious activity nearby," he said, finally looking at her. His eyes were cold, calculating. Ava almost wanted to laugh. She knew what this was. She'd seen it happen to so many others. The vague excuse. The fishing expedition. He didn't have anything on her, so he was trying to find something. Anything. "Suspicious activity," she echoed, keeping her voice steady. "What kind of activity?" The officer's lips curled into a smirk, but before he could answer, his partner, a younger, stockier man, approached from the passenger side, glancing at Ava like she was a piece of evidence to be catalogued. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer ordered, his hand resting on the handle of his gun now. Ava could feel the situation escalating unnecessarily, but she also knew that compliance was the only safe route, at least for now. Without a word, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car. As she stood by the side of the road, both officers circled her like vultures, looking her up and down. Ava kept her posture relaxed, but her mind was racing. Should she reveal who she was? Should she show them her FBI badge? Or would that only make things worse? She'd learned the hard way that power could either protect you or paint a bigger target on your back. Before she could decide, the younger officer grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back with unnecessary force. "What's going on?" Ava demanded, her calm starting to fracture under the weight of their aggression. "You're resisting arrest," the first officer said with a sneer. "For what?" Ava snapped, her patience running thin. "Suspicious behavior," he replied, his tone dripping with condescension. Ava could feel the pressure building in her chest. They didn't know who she was yet, but that was about to change. As the officers shoved her against the hood of her car, cuffing her wrists tightly behind her back, Ava's mind raced. This was wrong, completely unjustified, but she had to play it carefully. She couldn't afford to let her emotions take over, Not when they already saw her as a threat. "You have no idea what you're doing," Ava said, her voice steady despite the situation. "This is a mistake." The younger officer scoffed. "You people always say that. Everyone's innocent, right?" Ava bit back her retort, focusing on keeping her breathing calm. She wasn't just another face to be dismissed. She had power, more than they could ever imagine. But they didn't know that. Not yet. "I need to make a phone call," Ava said calmly, though her arms ached from the rough treatment. "I have rights." You'll get your call when we say so," the older officer snapped. He was getting impatient, clearly feeling the power trip of dominating the situation. Ava glanced around the street. A few neighbors had started to peek through their curtains, but no one was coming outside to intervene. It was always like this. Silence in the face of injustice, fear outweighing empathy. She couldn't count on anyone to help her. She had to help herself. After what felt like an eternity, they finally loaded her into the back of their cruiser, slamming the door shut with a sense of finality. As they drove her to the precinct, Ava remained quiet, formulating her next move. She could feel their smug satisfaction in the air, their assumption that they had just taken down another nobody. But Ava wasn't just anybody. At the station, she was roughly pulled from the cruiser and marched inside, her dignity stripped away with every step. The officers pushed her into a holding cell, locking the door behind them without so much as a glance. Now it was time to act. Ava knew exactly who to call. She had connections that these officers couldn't even fathom. She requested her phone call, and this time they couldn't refuse. She dialed a number she rarely used but knew by heart. Her direct line to the regional FBI director. "Director Langston," she said as the phone connected. "I'm in a bit of a situation." By the time she hung up, the wheels of justice had already begun to turn. Back at the front desk, the officers were laughing among themselves, trading stories of their tough night and patting each other on the back. They had no idea what was coming. It wasn't until their supervisor, Captain Harris, stormed into the precinct, eyes blazing with fury, that the officers realized something was wrong. The captain demanded to know why a federal agent had been arrested and mistreated. "Wait, what?" Officer Wilson stammered, his face draining of color. "That woman you just brutalized," Harris snarled, his voice barely containing his rage, "is a senior agent with the FBI. Eh?" The shock on the officers' faces was immediate, their arrogance crumbling in an instant. They had crossed a line, one that could cost them everything. The room went silent. Officer Wilson's smirk faded into disbelief, while Officer Daniels blinked as though trying to process what their captain had just said. The weight of the situation finally began to sink in. Ava Carter wasn't just another civilian they could push around. She was an FBI agent, someone with far more authority and influence than they could ever imagine. "I want to see her now," Captain Harris demanded, his voice sharp and cold. Wilson and Daniels exchanged nervous glances, the arrogance draining from their faces. They had been so sure of themselves, so confident in their power, but that power now seemed to be slipping through their fingers. Without another word, they led Captain Harris down the narrow hallway toward the holding cells, their minds racing with the potential fallout of their actions. Ava sat on the bench inside the small, dimly lit cell. She had seen this kind of behavior before, but being on the receiving end of such blatant racism and abuse of power was different. She'd expected better, hoped for better, but deep down, she wasn't surprised. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, but tonight, she was the one in need of it. The door to her cell swung open, and Captain Harris stepped inside. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that didn't escape Ava's notice. "Agent Carter, I'm terribly sorry for this," Harris said, his voice tinged with regret. "We had no idea." "You had no idea who I was," Ava cut in, standing up slowly, her gaze steady. "But you didn't need to know that to treat me with basic respect. This was never about my title." Captain Harris winced at her words, knowing she was right. His officers had acted on assumptions, letting their prejudices dictate their actions. And now they were about to pay the price for it. "I promise you," he said, "this will be handled. They'll face the consequences for what they did." Ava narrowed her eyes, assessing him carefully. She knew the system all too well. Promises were easy, but real accountability? That was a different story. They better, she replied firmly, because I'm not letting this go. As Harris nodded and motioned for the officers to remove the cuffs, Ava couldn't help but feel a surge of anger. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had been mistreated, abused, and judged unfairly. She wouldn't let these officers simply walk away with a slap on the wrist. The cuffs clicked off, and Ava rubbed her wrists, glaring at Wilson and Daniels as they stood to the side, looking pale and terrified. They weren't so tough now. The tables had turned, and they knew it. "I'll need your statements," Captain Harris said, his voice quieter now, as if trying to salvage some semblance of control in the situation. "But rest assured, Agent Carter, this won't go unnoticed." Ava nodded curtly but said nothing. She didn't trust empty words. The real justice would come not just from apologies or internal reviews, but from making sure people like Wilson and Daniels couldn't continue to abuse their power. As she gathered her belongings and walked out of the station, the cool night air hit her face, refreshing and grounding. Ava took a deep breath, her mind already turning over what needed to happen next. This incident had only solidified her resolve. She was going to make sure these officers regretted the day they let their prejudice blind them. The next morning, the fallout began. It started with a call to Ava's FBI superior, Director Langston. He was furious, more than furious, when he heard the full details of the night before. The chain of command in the FBI moved swiftly, and soon the police precinct where Ava had been detained found itself under intense scrutiny. Wilson and Daniels were both suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. The news quickly spread through the ranks of the police department, and whispers of their misconduct reached the public. But that wasn't enough for Ava. She knew this kind of behavior didn't just stop with two bad officers. There was a culture, an unspoken permission, within the force that allowed this kind of thing to happen, and she wasn't about to let it slide. The following week, Ava held a press conference. She stood before a sea of cameras, her expression calm but steely. It wasn't about seeking revenge. It was about exposing the truth, about demanding change in a system that had protected people like Wilson and Daniels for far too long. "Last week, I was pulled over, assaulted, and arrested for no reason other than the fact that two officers decided my appearance made me a suspect," Ava said, her voice strong and unwavering as she addressed the reporters. "What they didn't know is that I am an agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But my title shouldn't have mattered. No one, no matter their position, race, or background, should have to fear the people who are supposed to protect them." The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. Ava could feel the weight of their attention, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. These officers abused their power, and now they will face the consequences. But this is not just about two individuals. This is about a system that allows this kind of behavior to continue unchecked. This is about the countless others who have been victims of racial profiling, violence, and injustice. As Ava spoke, she could see the reporters nodding, some of them scribbling furiously in their notebooks, others snapping photos. The truth was out there now. There was no hiding from it. Back at the precinct, Wilson and Daniels sat in stunned silence as they watched Ava's press conference unfold on the station's TV. Their world was crumbling around them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. They had thought they were invincible, that the badge they wore would protect them from any consequences. But they had underestimated who they were dealing with. "She's going to ruin us," Wilson muttered under his breath, his hands shaking slightly. Daniels didn't respond. He knew it was true. As the investigation into their conduct deepened, more evidence came to light. Other officers in the department began to speak up, recounting instances where Wilson and Daniels had overstepped their authority, where their racial biases had influenced their decisions. It was a damning pattern, one that couldn't be ignored. By the time the department's internal review concluded, the verdict was clear. Both officers would be dismissed from the force, and formal charges of misconduct and assault would be filed against them. For Ava, it was a victory, but a bittersweet one. She knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war against systemic racism and abuse of power. But it was a start that would force the police department and others like it to take a hard look at their practices and the people they allowed to wear the badge. As Ava watched the aftermath unfold, she felt a sense of satisfaction, but also a renewed sense of purpose. She had stood up not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been pushed aside, and everyone who deserved better. And she wasn't done yet. The road ahead was long, but Ava Carter was more than ready to walk it. The day after the press conference, the story had spread like wildfire. News outlets across the country picked up on Ava Carter's fight for justice, shining a spotlight on police misconduct and the systemic racism that plagued law enforcement. Social media was flooded with outrage, with hashtags like #JusticeForAva and #EndPoliceBrutality trending nationwide. Ava sat at her kitchen table the morning after, her phone buzzing constantly with calls and messages from supporters, fellow agents, and journalists wanting interviews. She had expected attention, but the scale of the response was overwhelming. It seemed as if her story had tapped into a deep, festering wound that many had tried to ignore for far too long. As she scrolled through her messages, one caught her eye: an invitation to speak at a national summit on police reform. Ava knew this was her chance to push the conversation even further, to take her fight beyond the local precinct and into the national consciousness. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about changing the way the system treated people who looked like her. But before she could respond, a call came in from Director Langston. "Ava," he said, his voice steady, but with an edge of concern, "I've been keeping an eye on everything, and while I fully support what you're doing, I need to remind you that this fight could get messy. There will be pushback, not just from the police, but from people in high places. Are you prepared for that?" Ava paused, letting his words sink in. She knew the stakes. She had always known. Taking on systemic racism wasn't a battle that could be won overnight, and it wasn't without its risks. But she had come too far to back down now. "I understand, sir," she said after a moment, "but this isn't just personal anymore. This is about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. If that means facing pushback, then I'll be ready." Langston sighed, but there was a note of pride in his voice. "I expected nothing less from you, Agent Carter. Just know that the Bureau has your back. You're not alone in this." As the call ended, Ava felt a renewed sense of determination. She wasn't going to be silent. Not now and not ever again. The ripple effect of Ava's case continued to grow. The police department was under intense scrutiny, and more investigations were opened into officers with similar misconduct allegations. This was no longer just about Wilson and Daniels. Ava's story had become a catalyst for deeper reform. But not everyone was on her side. As expected, there were those who defended the officers' actions, claiming that Ava had been uncooperative and that the police had acted appropriately given the circumstances. The police union released a statement calling for due process and warning against rushing to judgment. Ava knew this was coming. She knew that for every step forward, there would be those trying to drag progress back. But she also knew that the truth was on her side, and the overwhelming support from the public outweighed the voices of dissent. A few days later, Ava stood before a packed auditorium at the National Summit on Police Reform. The room was filled with lawmakers, activists, community leaders, and members of law enforcement. Ava had been invited to give the keynote address, and as she stood at the podium, she could feel the weight of their expectations. But Ava wasn't nervous. This was her moment. She began by telling her story, not as an FBI agent, but as a Black woman who had experienced firsthand the dangers of racial profiling and police brutality. She spoke about the fear that millions of Black and brown people felt when they were stopped by the police, the fear that any minor encounter could escalate into violence. She talked about the systemic issues that allowed officers like Wilson and Daniels to continue working despite their history of misconduct, and how accountability was the only way forward. "We cannot continue to allow power to be wielded as a weapon against the vulnerable," Ava said, her voice echoing through the room. We need to rethink what it means to protect and serve, because protection should not come with conditions based on the color of your skin. The room erupted in applause, but Ava wasn't done. She pushed forward, calling for tangible changes. Body cameras on every officer, mandatory de-escalation training, and an independent oversight committee to investigate allegations of misconduct. We can no longer allow the system to police itself, she said, locking eyes with several lawmakers in the front row, because when that happens, justice isn't served. It's shielded from the light. As Ava finished her speech, the audience rose to their feet, giving her a standing ovation. It wasn't just her words that had moved them, it was the undeniable truth behind them. Ava wasn't just a victim, she was a fighter, and she had ignited a movement that could no longer be ignored. Back at the precinct, Wilson and Daniel's world continued to unravel. The public outrage had forced the district attorney to file formal charges against them for assault and misconduct, and their trial was set to begin within a month. Both men had tried to maintain their innocence, but the evidence was stacked against them, especially after the dashcam footage from the police cruiser was released, showing the officer's aggressive behavior toward Ava. In a small, dimly lit room, Wilson sat alone, his hands shaking as he watched the footage for the 100th time. He couldn't believe how far things had gone. He had always thought of himself as untouchable. After all, he was a cop. But now, that badge had become a symbol of everything he had lost. He glanced at the newspaper on the table in front of him. The headline read, "FBI Agent's Case Sparks National Call for Police Reform." Wilson's face twisted in regret, but it was too late for that now. He had made his choices, and now he was paying the price. He could only wonder what might have been different if he had taken just one moment, just one, to see Ava as a person rather than a target. For Ava, this was just the beginning. The battle for justice was far from over, but she knew one thing for sure. The system would change, even if she had to fight for it every single day. And she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Pregnant black doctor attacked by police. City braces for backlash. The story spread like wildfire. The footage from the gas station's security cameras, which clearly showed Serena being dragged from her car and violently restrained, was leaked online, igniting a social media storm. Hashtags like #JusticeForSerena and #EndPoliceBrutality began trending as activists, celebrities, and the public expressed their outrage over the blatant disregard for Serena's life and the life of her unborn child. The media quickly picked up on the fact that Serena wasn't just any woman. She was a nationally recognized OB/GYN, someone who had been working tirelessly to improve maternal health care for women of color. Her story struck a chord with the masses, especially among communities already weary of systemic racism in policing. Meanwhile, protests erupted in cities across the country, with Serena's name becoming synonymous with the fight for racial justice. Crowds gathered outside police stations, courthouses, and city halls, holding signs that read, "Protect Black Women," "Justice for Dr. Serena Walker," "End Racial Profiling Now." The pressure was mounting, and city officials scrambled to address the situation. The police department, initially hoping to downplay the incident, was now caught in the middle of a growing storm. The police chief, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a weathered face, held a press conference to try to mitigate the damage. "This was an unfortunate misunderstanding," the chief said, standing at the podium in front of a sea of reporters. "The officers involved are under investigation, and we are cooperating fully with the district attorney's office." But the public wasn't buying it. The press conference only seemed to add fuel to the fire, especially when the chief refused to answer questions about whether the officers would face any disciplinary action or be placed on leave. Back at the hospital, Serena's condition had stabilized. She was still in pain, both physically and emotionally, but the danger to her pregnancy had passed for the moment. However, the trauma of the encounter left her shaken. Even though she had been through so much in her life, facing systemic barriers as a Black woman in the medical field, this incident felt different. This attack had been on her dignity, her safety, and the life of her unborn child. Lying in the hospital bed, Serena watched the news coverage of her own story with a mix of disbelief and anger. She had always been careful, always played by the rules, thinking that her status and education would protect her from the ugliness of racial profiling. But now, it was painfully clear that no amount of success or respectability could shield her from the deep-rooted racism that ran through the veins of society. Malcolm, sitting beside her, squeezed her hand. "We're going to make them pay for this," he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. Serena nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "This isn't just about us, Malcolm. This is about every woman like me who's been mistreated, ignored, or silenced. We have to fight not just for ourselves, but for them too." Malcolm smiled, his heart swelling with pride. His wife had always been strong, but now, in the face of this personal tragedy, she was determined to use her voice to make a difference on a larger scale. 2 weeks later, the lawsuit was filed. Malcolm Walker had prepared meticulously, using his team of top-tier attorneys and leveraging his connections in the civil rights community to ensure that this case would make waves across the nation. The lawsuit accused officers Adams and Mitchell of excessive force, racial profiling, and reckless endangerment of both Serena and her unborn child. The police department and the city were also named in the lawsuit for their failure to properly train officers and prevent racial bias from influencing policing. The courtroom was packed when the first hearing took place. Reporters, activists, and even politicians showed up to witness what was quickly becoming one of the most high-profile cases of the year. The energy in the room was electric, and the tension between the two sides was palpable. As the case unfolded, Malcolm took center stage. His opening statement was a masterclass in law and emotion, blending cold, hard facts with the undeniable pain his family had endured. He didn't just speak for Serena, he spoke for every black person who had ever been wrongfully targeted by law enforcement, for every pregnant woman whose life was put in danger because of negligence or violence, and for every person who had ever been silenced by systemic injustice. "This case is not just about one woman's suffering," Malcolm said, his voice clear and unwavering. "It is about a system that has allowed unchecked power and prejudice to run rampant for far too long. It is about accountability. It is about justice. And most importantly, it is about change." The courtroom was silent as his words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The officers' defense team, meanwhile, tried to paint a very different picture. They argued that the officers had no way of knowing who Serena was, that they had acted in the interest of public safety, and that Serena had not cooperated fully with their requests. It was a predictable defense, but one that was difficult to stomach in light of the overwhelming evidence. The gas station's security footage was played for the jury, showing Serena's peaceful compliance and the officers' unnecessary aggression. The footage was damning, but Malcolm didn't stop there. He brought in character witnesses, Serena's colleagues, patients, and even fellow doctors who testified to her integrity, her contributions to the community, and her impeccable reputation. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Serena herself took the stand. Dressed in a simple black dress, Serena walked slowly to the witness stand, her body still recovering from the physical trauma of the attack. She sat down, her hands resting gently on her lap as she looked out at the courtroom. The weight of the moment was heavy on her shoulders, but she was ready. Malcolm approached her, his face softening as he began his questioning. "Dr. Walker," he said gently, "can you describe what happened to you the night of the attack?" Serena took a deep breath before speaking. "I had just finished a fundraiser for my charity. I was on my way home when I stopped at a gas station because I needed fuel. That's when the officers approached me." She paused, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "They accused me of being suspicious, of stealing my own car. They didn't listen to anything I said. And when I told them I was pregnant, they ignored me. They pushed me, restrained me, and left me in so much pain I thought I would lose my baby." Her voice wavered for a moment, and the courtroom sat in complete silence, hanging on every word. "They treated me like I was nothing, like my life didn't matter. But it does. and so does the life of my child. The emotion in her words was undeniable. The jury, the judge, and even the spectators in the room seemed visibly moved by her testimony. As the case continued, the tension outside the courtroom mirrored the intensity inside. Protesters lined the streets, calling for justice not just for Serena, but for every person who had been wronged by the system. The case had become a symbol of the larger fight against police brutality, racial profiling, and the mistreatment of black women. In a surprise move, several prominent civil rights organizations announced their support for Serena's case, offering legal resources and media coverage to ensure that this wasn't just another case that faded into the background. This was becoming a watershed moment, and the public was watching closely. The morning of the final day of the trial dawned cold and gray, as if the weather itself could feel the weight of what was about to transpire. For days, the courtroom had been the center of national attention, and today it would be no different. Outside the courthouse, throngs of people gathered, holding signs demanding justice. News vans lined the street, and reporters huddled together, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the key players in this historic case. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was even more tense. Every seat in the courtroom was taken. Journalists, activists, supporters, and even legal scholars who had come to witness what had become a landmark case in the fight against racial profiling and police brutality. Malcolm Walker, standing tall in his sharp navy blue suit, exuded confidence as he prepared to deliver his final argument. His heart, however, was heavy with the personal toll this case had taken on his family. His wife, Serena, though strong and resilient, had endured unspeakable trauma. She was now in the final stages of her pregnancy, and despite the physical toll of the past months, she remained a beacon of courage. Across the courtroom, Officers Adams and Mitchell sat at the defense table, their expressions blank, but their tension was palpable. They had grown increasingly uneasy as the case progressed, watching their defense unravel under the weight of undeniable evidence. Their defense attorney, a well-known legal figure who had previously handled many police misconduct cases, had struggled to build a convincing case, and today was his last chance to salvage what remained of their defense. The defense's final attempt. As the courtroom quieted, the defense attorney rose from his seat and approached the jury. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and began his closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he started, his voice steady, but lacking the confidence that had characterized his earlier arguments. "I understand the emotion surrounding this case. What happened that night is tragic. No one disputes that. However, we must not let our emotions cloud our judgment of the facts." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "My clients, Officers Adams and Mitchell, were simply doing their jobs. They were patrolling a high-crime area, and when they saw a vehicle they didn't recognize, driven by someone they believed to be acting suspiciously, they took action. They did not know who Dr. Serena Walker was at the time. They had no knowledge of her background, her profession, or the fact that she was pregnant." The defense attorney paced slowly in front of the jury, his hands clasped behind his back. In that moment, they believed they were dealing with a potential threat. Yes, mistakes were made, but these were not the actions of malicious individuals. They were the actions of officers trying to ensure public safety. His voice grew more earnest as he tried to appeal to the jurors' sense of reason. These men are not monsters. They did not wake up that morning intending to harm anyone. What happened was a tragic misunderstanding, a lapse in judgment under tense circumstances. But it does not rise to the level of criminal behavior. I ask you to consider this carefully when you deliberate. These men deserve fairness, just as any citizen would in a court of law. The defense attorney returned to his seat, his face betraying the knowledge that his words had likely done little to sway the jury. He glanced briefly at Adams and Mitchell, who sat stiffly, their hands folded tightly in front of them. Malcolm's closing argument. As Malcolm stood up to deliver his final argument, the room seemed to hold its breath. He walked slowly to the center of the courtroom, his gaze steady, his movements deliberate. He didn't need to rush. His words would carry the weight they needed to on their own. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Malcolm began, his voice calm but firm. "We are here today because my wife, Dr. Serena Walker, was treated with a level of violence, disregard, and disrespect that no human being should ever have to endure." He paused for a moment, letting the silence amplify the impact of his words before continuing. "This case is not about a misunderstanding. It's not about a momentary lapse in judgment. It's about the systemic issues that have plagued our society for far too long. Issues of bias, prejudice, and a deep-rooted belief in the inferiority of certain people based on the color of their skin." Malcolm began to walk slowly in front of the jury, his hands gesturing to punctuate his points. "My wife, Dr. Serena Walker, is a respected physician, a mother-to-be, a woman who has spent her life fighting to save the lives of others. And yet, on that night, she was not seen as any of those things. She was seen as a threat, not because of anything she did, but because of who she is, because of the color of her skin." The jurors watched him intently, the gravity of his words sinking in. "Officers Adams and Mitchell didn't just fail to protect my wife that night, they actively endangered her. They ignored her pleas for help. They dismissed her when she told them she was pregnant. They used excessive force when none was needed, and they nearly caused her to lose the life of our child." Malcolm's voice wavered slightly, the emotion of the moment catching up with him, but he quickly regained his composure. "This case is about more than just my wife. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that those who wield power in our society are held responsible for their actions. It's about making sure that no one, no woman, no black person, no mother, has to fear for their life when encountering those who are supposed to protect them." He turned to face the jury directly, his eyes locking with each member of the panel. "Today, you have the power to send a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated, that our society will no longer turn a blind eye to injustice, and that every life, no matter the color of their skin, is worth protecting." Malcolm returned to his seat, the courtroom so quiet that the only sound was the faint rustling of papers from the court clerk's desk. He had said everything that needed to be said. The jury deliberates. As the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Outside, the streets were filled with protesters, holding signs and chanting slogans in support of Serena and the fight for justice. The national media continued to cover the trial, with live reports coming in from every major network. Inside the courthouse, Serena sat beside Malcolm, her hand resting on her belly. The baby had moved several times during the trial, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Malcolm leaned over and kissed her hand gently, whispering, "We did everything we could. Now it's in their hands." The jury deliberated for hours, and as the day wore on, the tension only grew. Reporters speculated on what the long deliberation meant. Were the jurors divided? Was there a holdout? Inside the deliberation room, the jurors debated the evidence, the testimony, and the closing arguments. Some were moved by the defense's plea for understanding, but the majority were swayed by the undeniable facts of the case. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom late in the afternoon, the air was thick with anticipation. The judge called the court to order, and the foreman of the jury stood to deliver the verdict. The room was silent, the only sound the faint clicking of pens and the soft murmur of reporters preparing to take notes. "In the matter of Dr. Serena Walker versus Officers Adams and Mitchell," the foreman began, his voice steady but solemn, "we, the jury, find the defendants guilty of excessive force, reckless endangerment, and racial profiling." A collective gasp filled the room, followed by murmurs of approval from the supporters gathered in the gallery. Serena closed her eyes, a wave of relief washing over her as she realized that justice had been served. Malcolm squeezed her hand tightly, his face a mixture of pride and emotion. The judge turned to the officers, his face stern. "Officers Adams and Mitchell, you have been found guilty of serious charges. Your actions endangered the life of a woman and her unborn child. This court finds your conduct to be a gross violation of your duties as police officers, and you will be held accountable." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before delivering the sentence. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in state prison, and you will each pay a civil penalty for the damages caused by your actions. The courtroom erupted in a flurry of activity. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Activists embraced one another, and outside the courthouse, the crowds cheered in celebration. The chants of "Justice for Serena" rang out through the streets, a powerful reminder that change, though slow, was possible. The aftermath. As Serena and Malcolm left the courthouse, they were met with a throng of reporters, all eager to hear their reaction to the verdict. Serena, though tired and still recovering from the physical and emotional toll of the past months, stood tall as she addressed the crowd. "This victory is not just mine," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This is a victory for every woman, every person of color, who has ever been mistreated, ignored, or silenced by those in power. This is a step toward accountability, but it is only one step. We still have so much work to do to ensure that no one else has to endure what I went through." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the crowd, her hand resting gently on her belly. "Today I stand not just for myself, but for my child. I stand for the future, and I promise you I will continue to fight for justice, for equality, and for the dignity of all people." The crowd erupted in applause, and as Serena and Malcolm walked away, hand in hand, they knew that this was just the beginning of a larger fight. But for now, they had won a victory that would resonate for years to come. The days following the trial's conclusion passed in a whirlwind of emotions for Serena and Malcolm. They had won a significant battle, but as they quickly realized, the war for justice and equality was far from over. Every headline, every news report reminded them of the larger fight ahead. Serena spent the first few days after the verdict at home, physically drained from the pregnancy and the emotional toll the trial had taken on her. Though she had emerged victorious in the courtroom, she felt anything but triumphant. The constant media attention made it difficult for her to find peace. Reporters camped outside their house, eager for a statement or a candid photograph. She couldn't step outside without feeling the weight of the public eye on her shoulders. At night, Serena struggled to sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, she was back at the gas station, the flashing lights of the patrol car burning into her memory. She could still feel the officers' hands on her, the cold pavement beneath her, and the overwhelming fear that her baby might not survive the encounter. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was a reality she had lived through, and the trauma of it clung to her, refusing to let go. Malcolm, too, was dealing with the aftermath in his own way. Though he had won the case, securing justice for his wife, he found little solace in the victory. He had spent years as a civil rights attorney, fighting for the rights of others, but this time had been different. This time, it was his family that had been attacked. His wife, the woman he loved, had been treated as less than human. And while the officers had been held accountable, the larger system that allowed such abuses to continue remained intact. One evening, as Serena sat quietly by the window, watching the sun set over their neighborhood, Malcolm approached her with a glass of water and sat down beside her. "You've been quiet all day," he said gently, placing his hand on her shoulder. Serena nodded, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "Even though we won the trial, it doesn't feel like enough. Those officers are going to prison, but the system that created them, the system that allowed them to treat me that way, is still out there." Malcolm nodded in agreement, his expression somber. "It's true. This was just one case, one victory. But there are thousands more just like it, and most of them don't get the attention yours did." Serena turned to look at him, her eyes filled with resolve. "We need to do more, Malcolm. I want to use my voice, my platform, to help other women, other mothers, who have been through what I've been through. We can't let this end with me. We have to keep fighting." Malcolm squeezed her hand, a sense of pride welling up inside him. Despite everything she had been through, Serena remained as strong and determined as ever. "I'll be right beside you," he said quietly. "Whatever you need, I'm with you." The following week, Serena and Malcolm sat down to discuss their next steps. They had already begun receiving offers from various advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and media outlets, all eager to hear from Serena. But they knew that simply giving interviews or attending rallies wouldn't be enough to create lasting change. They needed to do something bigger, something that would make a real impact. Malcolm suggested forming a foundation, an organization dedicated to fighting for the rights of women of color, particularly in the areas of maternal health, criminal justice, and police reform. It would be a way to continue their work, not just in response to what had happened to Serena, but in service of a much larger cause. "We could call it the Walker Foundation," Malcolm suggested, his voice filled with excitement as they brainstormed ideas late into the night. "It could be a nonprofit that focuses on advocacy, education, and policy reform. We'd offer legal support to women who've been wrongfully targeted, and we could partner with healthcare providers to improve maternal care for women of color." Oh! Serena's eyes lit up at the idea. It was exactly what she had been thinking, a way to turn her personal experience into a force for good. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with hope for the first time in weeks. "And we could hold workshops, provide training for police officers on racial bias, and create a network of support for women who need it." Over the next several months, Serena and Malcolm worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. They partnered with civil rights attorneys, healthcare professionals, and community leaders to lay the foundation for what would become a powerful voice in the fight for justice and equality. As they worked to build the organization, they began receiving stories from women across the country. Women who had faced discrimination, violence, and neglect at the hands of the police or the healthcare system. Each story fueled their resolve to keep going, to fight harder. Despite the emotional toll the work took on them, Serena and Malcolm knew that they were making a difference. Their foundation quickly gained national attention, and donations poured in from supporters who believed in their mission. Serena became a sought-after speaker at conferences, rallies, and media appearances, sharing her story and advocating for change. Meanwhile, Serena's recovery. While Serena was pouring her energy into the foundation, she couldn't ignore the toll that the past months had taken on her health, both physical and emotional. Her pregnancy was entering its final stages, and her doctor had advised her to take things easy, reminding her that stress could have a negative impact on both her and the baby. One night, after a particularly long day of meetings and planning sessions, Serena collapsed onto the couch, her body aching with exhaustion. Malcolm sat beside her, concern etched on his face. "You need to rest, Serena," he said softly. "The foundation is important, but so is your health, and the baby's health. We can't afford to lose you." Serena nodded, knowing he was right, but she struggled to let go of the sense of urgency she felt. "I just don't want to stop," she admitted. "I feel like if I slow down, all of this, everything we're fighting for, will lose momentum." Malcolm reached out and took her hand, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to do it all at once. The foundation is strong, and it will continue even if you take some time to focus on yourself. You've already done so much. Now, you need to take care of you and our baby." For the first time in a while, Serena allowed herself to truly relax. She leaned into Malcolm, feeling the warmth and safety of his embrace. "You're right," she whispered. "I'll take a break, but only for a little while." And with that, Serena finally allowed herself to rest, knowing that the fight for justice would still be there when she was ready to return. The impact of the Walker case spread far and wide, far beyond the confines of their local community. As news outlets across the country continued to report on the verdict and the subsequent activism spearheaded by Serena and Malcolm, the couple found themselves at the heart of a growing movement for systemic change. In the months following the trial, several states introduced legislation aimed at addressing racial bias in policing. These proposed reforms included mandatory training programs focused on de-escalation tactics, implicit bias awareness, and the use of non-lethal methods in confrontational situations. While some police unions pushed back, arguing that these reforms would make it harder for officers to do their jobs, public opinion was overwhelmingly in favor of change. One of the key reforms that emerged from the Walker case was the nationwide push for body camera mandates. Serena and Malcolm had worked closely with lawmakers to ensure that officers would be required to wear body cameras during all interactions with the public, ensuring that incidents like what happened to Serena would be captured and held accountable. Serena, invited to testify before Congress, stood before the packed chamber, her voice calm and clear as she delivered her testimony on the need for police reform. She spoke not only from personal experience, but from the perspective of a mother, a doctor, and an advocate for justice. "The trauma I endured was not an isolated incident," she told the members of Congress. "It's part of a pattern, one that disproportionately affects Black and brown people across this country. We must act now to address these issues, not just to prevent future tragedies, but to build a system that truly protects and serves all citizens, regardless of race or background." Her words resonated with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, and soon after, the Serena Walker Police Accountability Act was introduced in several states. The bill called for independent investigations into all cases of police misconduct, the implementation of body camera programs, and the creation of civilian oversight boards to review complaints against officers. Media attention and public perception. As Serena and Malcolm continued their work with the foundation and lawmakers, the media kept a close eye on their progress. News segments and talk shows frequently invited them to speak, and Serena found herself becoming a leading voice in the movement for police reform. Her poise, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to justice endeared her to many, and she quickly became a symbol of hope for those fighting similar battles. But with the increased visibility came increased scrutiny. Serena and Malcolm faced criticism from some corners, particularly from law enforcement advocates who viewed their efforts as an attack on the police. They received hate mail and online harassment, with some accusing them of using Serena's ordeal for personal gain or political leverage. Serena struggled with the negativity at times, but Malcolm was always there to remind her why they were doing this work. People are always going to resist change, especially when it challenges their power, Malcolm told her one night after she had read through a particularly hurtful email. "But we're not doing this for them. We're doing it for the people who don't have a voice, who've been silenced or ignored. That's who we're fighting for." And so, despite the backlash, Serena pressed on. The Walker Foundation grew rapidly, expanding its reach across the country. Their team of legal experts, doctors, and activists provided support to families who had been affected by police violence and healthcare discrimination, and the foundation became a national leader in the fight for maternal health equity and criminal justice reform. The Walker Foundation's first major victory. One of the foundation's first major successes came when they took on the case of Maya Johnson, a young Black woman who had been wrongfully arrested during a routine traffic stop. Maya, who was 5 months pregnant at the time, had been subjected to similar treatment as Serena, pushed to the ground and handcuffed without cause. The incident had left her traumatized, and like Serena, she had feared for the safety of her unborn child. With the help of the Walker Foundation, Maya's case went to court, and she won a significant settlement from the police department. But more than the financial compensation, Maya's case helped set a precedent for how pregnant women and women of color should be treated by law enforcement. "It's not just about me," Maya said during a press conference after the verdict. "It's about every woman who has been mistreated, who has been told that her life doesn't matter. Thanks to Serena and Malcolm, I got justice. And now I want to help others get the same." The victory bolstered the Walker Foundation's credibility and influence, and soon they were taking on more cases, helping women across the country fight back against injustice. The day Serena gave birth to their daughter was a day of joy and relief, a culmination of all the fear, hope, and love that had carried them through the storm. The baby, a healthy, beautiful girl, came into the world with a loud cry, filling the room with life and promise. Serena, exhausted but overjoyed, cradled her daughter in her arms, tears of happiness streaming down her face. Malcolm stood beside her, his own eyes glistening with emotion, as he kissed Serena's forehead and gazed down at their child. "Grace," Serena whispered, the name they had chosen for their daughter. "Welcome to the world, my sweet girl." In that moment, everything felt right. After all the pain, the fear, and the struggle, they had made it. Their family was whole, and the future, though uncertain, was full of hope. Continuing the fight. Even after Grace's birth, Serena and Malcolm didn't slow down. Their mission, to create a better world for their daughter and for all children, continued to drive them forward. The Walker Foundation expanded its reach even further, opening offices in several states and partnering with national organizations to tackle issues of racial injustice, police reform, and health care inequity. Serena balanced her work as a mother with her role as a leader in the foundation. Though she had scaled back some of her public appearances, she remained deeply involved in the organization's day-to-day operations, mentoring young activists, working with lawmakers, and continuing to speak out on behalf of those who had been silenced. As the years went by, Serena's legacy only grew. She was invited to speak at international conferences on human rights and became a leading voice in the global movement for racial justice. Her work with the Walker Foundation earned her numerous awards, but it was never the recognition that mattered to Serena. It was the change she saw happening around her, the new policies, the lives saved, the families supported, that fueled her passion. Grace's future. As Grace grew older, she became more aware of the work her parents were doing. By the time she was 5, she was already asking questions about the marches and protests she saw on TV. And Serena and Malcolm took great care to explain the importance of standing up for what's right. "One day, Grace, you'll understand just how much we fought for you," Serena would tell her daughter as they watched the news together. "But until then, just know that everything we're doing is for your future, and for the future of all children like you." Grace would nod, her young mind absorbing the weight of her mother's words, even if she didn't fully understand them yet. But one thing was certain. She was growing up in a world that was better than the one Serena had faced. And for Serena, that was the greatest victory of all. The end.